Got it.
Okay, I'm gonna get the show on the road. You ready?
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very exciting episode of the Homesteaducation Podcast. This is Angela of Axe and Root Homestead here. And as always, I have my co-host Mandi at Wild Oak Farms. Hi, Mandi.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well, and I'm very excited because we have an incredibly special guest with us today. The very brilliant and amazing Temple Grandin is here on our show. Hi, Temple.
Hi, good to be here.
Thank you. Now, Temple, do you prefer Temple, Dr. Grandin? How are
Call me
you?
Temple, that's okay.
Are you sure?
Yeah, Temple's okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So thank you so much for agreeing to be on our show.
Yeah, we are so just fortunate to be able to be sitting here talking with you. Before we get started though, Temple, I want to, you two know each other a little bit, right? Loosely, very, very loosely. Angela, do you want to fill people in just very briefly?
Absolutely. So I had the good fortune to meet Temple at the Homestead Festival last year. I was in the hotel lobby for breakfast and I saw Temple sitting there having a conversation with one of her colleagues. And I decided to muster up the courage to go up to her and introduce myself. And we had a very nice conversation about book publishing. And, a few months later, it came time to where my publisher of my own book, The Sustainable Homestead, asked me to reach out to some people and see if they would be interested in writing a foreword for my book. And one of those people I reached out to was the Temple Grandin. I had no idea if I had her correct email address, and I figured she wouldn't even get a chance to read it. But lo and behold, she was gracious enough with her time that she decided that yes, she would indeed write the foreword for my book. And so I've gotten to speak to her in a few conversations since then. And she's just a lovely person.
Well, it's really great to be here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I think we'll jump right in so we don't waste anybody's time, but we're going to talk to you about your paper,
grazing, my paper right here.
You got it. I have it too.
Sheep and goats. Yep.
Okay. So everybody, we'll put it in show notes, a link to the paper, but it's incredible. So you all should take the time to read it. So Temple, your paper explains importance of rotational grazing and planting cover crops.
Yeah,
both for
also grazing those cover crops.
Yeah.
And what I did in this paper is I just found every scientific study I could find. I refuted because a lot of people are saying, that cattle and other ruminants are just wrecking the land, but they can actually improve land if you use them right. There's a place for ruminants. In fact, today I just read in the Wall Street Journal that goats love to eat Christmas trees. And
they do.
Using goats to get rid of Christmas trees.
I can confirm that. We have dairy goats and they love them. It's like candy.
Yeah, they said balsam was the favorite.
Yeah. So why do you think that more farmers and folks in agriculture haven't already blended grazing ruminants and cash crops?
Well, the problem is farming has gotten highly specialized. And now one of the things making people look at this is soil health has gotten bad. See, the thing about doing monocultures, in the short term, it works great. It works just fabulous. But in the long term, it doesn't. And also with fertilizer prices going up, that's motivated people. Also with supply chain problems in fertilizer. And so more and more people are putting cover crops in to improve soil health. But to make them pay, you need to graze them.
Yeah.
That's what you need to be doing. If you graze them, then you also get the fertilizer from the animals. But you've got to do the grazing right. The other thing is it's very site specific, very climate specific. And what works in one place will not work somewhere else. So I cannot emphasize the importance of getting really good local advice from people that know what works in the local conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good advice for so many different things. I mean, we talk about it all the time. Angela and I both live in different climates as well as you. And so what we're learning about our climate or microclimate and what you're learning or anybody else is learning is not going to be necessarily the same.
That's right. You see, the other thing on the grazing, people complain that cattle take up too much land. But the thing is you've got like 100 miles of eastern Colorado, where the only thing that you can do on that land is to graze it. There's no other way to raise food on that land except grazing. But I want to emphasize you have to do it right. And you got to do just the right amount of grazing and start putting in, pasture rotation systems.
Yeah.
Okay, so that brings me to my next question, and that's an excellent segue, that point you just made about Colorado. So let's take a land that is maybe too arid or sandy for growing cash crops. But you also explained in your paper that land typically takes 3 to 5 years to see any recovery in
That's right.
nutrients.
It doesn't happen overnight. That's what
Right.
every study is showing. 3 to 5 years to start to really, really show the benefits.
So do you think if somebody was rotationally grazing and had cover crops, and they wait 3 to 5 years, do you think that the land could regain fertility enough to then grow cash crops?
Well, no, there's certain land you're never going to grow cash crops on it. That eastern Colorado land is too arid. There's not enough water, either out of the sky or out of the ground, for cash crops. There's no way. And you see the same thing with sand hills in Nebraska. It's too hilly. You've got hill country in California. You can graze livestock on it, but it's too steep for crops. And then of course you've got your prime farmland in places like Iowa. Those are places where they need to be doing some grazing on cover crops with cash crops. And that's where cash crops like soybeans and corn really grow well.
So I had a question I was going to save for the end, but I'm going to jump to it now because we just touched on water. And this is something that I've been sort of wondering for a while, is you mentioned lack of water in the ground and in the air, but yet there are cattle that are staying hydrated. What is their source of hydration?
Well, there's enough water to water the cattle, but watering the cattle takes a very small amount of water compared to watering a cash crop.
Got it.
Okay, so one thing I read on the University of Nebraska website, because I saw that you had a lot of familiarity with University of Nebraska, is it said that it could take, depending on the steer, the species, the health, the size of the animal, it could take 3 to 30 gallons of water to hydrate that animal per day. If that is the case, and they're pumping that much water to one steer, let alone an entire herd.
But the crops are getting a lot more than that.
The crops are getting more than that.
Yeah, the crops would be getting, the whole big field full of crops is getting way, way, way more water.
Way more water than what it would
cattle
take.
Would be getting.
Than what it would take to hydrate the herd.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now the other thing that's getting to be a trend is a lot of these ranchers in Nebraska and in eastern Colorado, they need smaller cows. If people are just breeding for meat, they tend to breed really big cattle. Now that's good for meat, but it's not good for the ranch because that big steer has a sister that's huge and she's too expensive to feed in the wintertime. And so you want a more moderate sized cow to live out in the ranch because they're less expensive to feed in the wintertime, especially if you have to feed hay, that can get very, very expensive.
Sure.
It's kind of like the point that you make about certain breeds not being cut out for pasture versus feedlots.
It's not so much the breeds, it's like lines of cattle within a breed.
Got it.
When you take Angus, for example, you got great big ones, but there's also smaller ones, and the red Angus have been less selected for meat. So in eastern Colorado, you see a lot of red Angus because in that arid country, they need a smaller cow that can be overwintered more economically.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really, I think about it, but not really. You put it, it's very simple the way you put it.
Big cows take more feed.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Right. I want to jump back up to, in your experience or opinion, what are some of the biggest mistakes that stick out to you when you see folks trying to implement rotational grazing?
One of the big mistakes is not allowing enough recovery time in between rotations. What people forget, and this is a very, very basic principle, the green leaves on top regenerate before the roots And nature has a reason for that. It's got to get its solar panels up so it can get energy to grow. And you have to let the roots regenerate enough. And that takes longer than regenerating the green part of the plant. So you need to get extremely good local advice to make sure you're evaluating the roots. And the other principle is to kind of like eat half, just the right amount of grazing. You don't want to
overgraze.
Overgraze, you don't want that. But you don't want to just have them bite the tops off the plants. You take about half and then you rotate. That's another basic principle. But again, things are extremely local.
I think regardless of your species of animal that you're rotating, whether it be one variety, if you're co-species intergrazing, whatever cover crop you have, I think you had made a good point within your paper that if you're overgrazing and you're not allowing enough regenerative growth, it's just as detrimental.
Well, that's totally detrimental to the land.
Yeah.
And there's been land ruined with overgrazing. I'm not going to try to cover that up. I've seen it. Just chew it down to nothing. No, that wrecks land. Recently, I was just out in Kentucky this fall, and there was some producers there starting to do rotational grazing. And there was some messed up pasture, and then there was some where I think they were starting to do it right.
Mm-hmm.
And then it takes effort to move them. But if you work with your cattle, they can get easy to move.
Okay. So I want to step away from arid landscapes for a moment and talk about something that a location that might have more hydration and the opportunity to host more lush vegetation. It sounds like in your travels, you've seen some places where they are rotating cover crops and then grazing and introducing cash crops. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I think I want to, just for folks listening who may have not read your paper, I want to see if I got this right. So your suggestion, let's say we have field A, would be that we could plant a cover crop, then we could bring in some stock to graze that down rather than use an herbicide.
And then you plow that crop cover what's left under.
After
as a cover crop, you graze it, you grow it, then you graze it. Another thing that people are doing is grazing corn stalks after they've harvested the corn, and they'll turn cattle in on that. I've seen a lot of that in Nebraska.
Okay.
Now,
silage.
Cover crops improve soil health, and there's one practice I think is just disgusting, is farmers were putting in a cover crop for soil health and then killing it with Roundup. No, that's not the thing to do. The thing to be doing is to graze the cover crop, and then after you've grazed it, you can plow it under, and then you've got fertilizer from the animals.
And then you can put your cash crop in.
Yeah, that's right. And you're going, to every third year with the cover crop.
And then I assume, like with the corn example, if corn is your cash crop, then once that season it's been harvested, you can return the animal to the field and they'll graze on that stubble.
Yeah,
correct.
This is where you see what's happened is farming's gotten very specialized.
Mm-hmm.
And what a farmer needs to do is work for the local rancher that can bring the cattle in, let them graze it and then take the cattle out.
So it's almost like
the thing that there's two things that are really starting to get people's interest in this: soil health. The other thing is end runoff, and then also the price of artificial fertilizer. That went way, way, way up.
I think that's such an important point because there are so many farms that maybe just grow soybeans or corn, and they're paying to bring in compost or other forms of fertilizer from nearby farms. And so the thought for me had always been, why not work with a local rancher, or why not keep a small herd of cattle that you can go in and graze and have that manure fertilize the land for you. But I like your idea even more of just working with another local farm and sort of creating an interrelationship, like a community.
People are doing those things.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is what works for cover crop in one place doesn't work somewhere else. Again, I've been to some seminars on, they say that what you put in the cedar, that's the $1 million question. What I recommend is really good local advice. Now, one of the things that's been a turnoff for corn and soybean farmers just starting out, so they've had consultants coming in and say, well, you need to put 100 different seeds in the cedar, and the farmers going, that's too hard. Let's start off with something really simple. You can you can graze wheat before it heads out, and that's grass-fed beef. As long as you graze it before it makes heads, before it has grain on it.
Mhm.
You can graze wheat. In fact, what you can do with wheat's really cool. You can graze it halfway down, then let it grow and have a crop of wheat.
Yeah.
So you're getting two
That's
uses out of the
right.
same crop.
That-
Yes.
Some places that will work. It's not going to work
Sure.
everywhere.
Sure.
Why do you, this is not a question that we had kind of talked about, but it's just sparked, as we're talking, why do you think that soil health is more of a forefront in people's minds now versus 10, 20 years ago? Why weren't we talking about this?
Because they didn't realize they were wrecking it 10, 15 years ago. See, this is the thing with the monoculture. In the short run, it works great. In the long run, it doesn't.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Biodiversity is good, whether it's in your gut, whether it's in your soil microorganisms.
Love
And
that.
the thing I have found on a lot of things is the little people innovate. I don't care if it's electronic industry. Well, there's a company right now that's making this AI program that can do writing, and professors are really concerned students are going to let that AI program do their homework for them.
Oh gosh.
That was invented by a small company. Little people innovate.
Yeah.
Big people copy. Little people innovate. And I don't care what industry you are in. That is true.
What's the
And
saying?
let's look at something like Facebook that started in a dorm room, or Google started in a dorm room, and they came up with the idea of PageRank, and that was a brilliant idea. You know how you have academic citations on journal articles? Well, PageRank is sort of like an internet version of academic citations. In other words, the more hits a website got, it would go up in the search findings. That was, I can remember when that first came out, and that was very novel, very innovative. And compared to the old search engines like Alta Vista, a huge improvement.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean,
That
it's all.
see, that's a very simple idea that really made a lot of difference.
Evolution. For our listeners who have maybe not read your paper, even though we're going to encourage everybody to read it, can you better explain intense mob grazing and where it may or may not be useful or appropriate?
What mob grazing does is duplicate the way herds of wildebeest or herds of bison used to graze when they were migrating. And a whole bunch of animals come into it, all packed together really tight for a few days, mow that grass down to about half, and then move on. That's what they did. What mob grazing does is use fencing to kind of mimic that. So you take a bunch of cattle, you crowd them in really tight for just a few days, and then you move them. Now it works better. That works better in the more higher rainfall areas. That's the principle of mob grazing. And then you're moving them every day or every 2 days. You're moving them all the time. You've got to do it right to avoid problems with animals getting stressed. One study showed they got stressed, but I think part of the problem was they had very small group sizes, like 7 animals. And then the animal is always watching its backside so he doesn't get shocked on the electric fence. But that's the principle of mob grazing. And in the more arid areas, you're probably better off in, like 3 or 4 pastures
to rotate through.
But the other thing the mob grazing does is it stops the animals from cherry picking the pasture, or what Fred Provenza says, eat the best and leave the rest. In other words, pick all the candy off and not eat the celery.
That's what goats do all the time.
Then they have to mow it.
Yeah.
That's the principle.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So, I mean, it can be implemented, like you said, in areas with heavier, decent rainfall, not everywhere. So get local advice, right?
Where in the droughts here in eastern Colorado, they had to cut back the cattle anywhere from 20 to 50%. Now, right now, I got massive snowstorms out on those plains, and that's going to be giving a lot of moisture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I had 2-part question. I'm kind of going to combine them into one. So we are in a wetter climate here on the East Coast. We are in central New Jersey, my farm.
Yes, that'd be a wetter climate. That's right.
Yes. And so We have a rotational grazing circuit of 2 Clydesdale horses. We have 5 sheep and a flock of ducks and geese, and that is the order that we circulate them through. And we rotate everybody about every 2 to 3 days during peak forage growth season. So this is going to be spring when things are really getting going into late summer. Things start to slow in the fall. Now, the other thing that is really important is the forageable cover crops that we've chosen don't just meet the crude protein and nutritional needs of the animals we're grazing. They also do things for the soil. So a spring forage cover crop that we have is going to be forage turnip and forage radish, because that expansion is going to help to loosen compacted soil. But then there's other things that, as I've gone along in my research, that I've learned, okay, you don't want to use something like a Piper Sudan grass, because that's going to contain a prussic acid content that can be toxic to horses if grazed when there's a frost. And then we've all known or been familiar, if you have any experience with horses, that clover can cause them to salivate. So we use a white clover because it has the lowest levels of mycotoxins. What I'm getting at,
you're learning what works in your area. And that is really good, because many I've heard people say, oh, we tried something that didn't work. It's so site specific. It's, it's local specific. Cannot emphasize that enough. Somebody wanting to get into this needs to get extremely good local advice.
Why do you think so many people may struggle to understand that it not only is site specific, but the cover crops that you're planting are soil and species specific?
Well, that's right. You've got to do the right local things. There's basic principles like allowing the roots to recover, and the roots recover more slowly than the green stuff. That's a basic principle. Usually you graze, if it's pasture, you want to graze about half of it, just the right amount of grazing. A cover crop, you can graze it down and then plow it under. Or if you're using no-till, but I think cover crops need to be grazed, because otherwise they don't make money.
I was going to say, it makes sense, because then you're also then feeding, you're improving the soil and also then feeding the animal, versus what you said earlier, how some folks are just tilling it in.
Well, this is the thing. I think you see some of the very best cropland in Iowa, places like that, was created by herds of bison. Grazing animals created some of the best cropland. They're part of the land. And when I learned that, I'm going, there's a place for the grazing animal. And one of the reasons why I wrote this paper is I was sick and tired of just hearing all the ruminants getting bashed when they may be part of the solution for improving the soil.
It's all about shifting the mindset and kind of retraining what so many people have maybe potentially read or learned.
They talk about things like cattle take up too much land. Well, what are you going to do with eastern Colorado if you don't graze it? Cannot crop it.
Yeah, you can't grow food.
No, you can't grow food. The only way to grow food on eastern Colorado is about a 100-mile stretch on I-70. And I've been down that, where grazing is the only thing you can do on that land.
I think a buzzword or buzz phrase we hear a lot right now is carbon sequestration.
Yeah, then you can get some carbon sequestration.
And that is through the act of grazing, mowing, if you will.
That's right. And there's certain places where livestock should not be, and that Amazon, that is one of them. So I've just read some really icky article today just on gold mining in these places, and contaminating everything with mercury. That's really bad.
But carbon sequestration happens when growth and forage regenerates. And so the mowing needs to happen. The grazing needs to happen, because that's how carbon is absorbed through photosynthesis. The right
amount of grazing. You take about half.
Yeah.
Because if then the plant is able to regenerate, and mowing actually can stimulate growth.
Yeah. I mean, I hope everybody is kind of taking notes, because you're reiterating the very important parts. I want to ask a question that is near and dear to my heart. So in your paper, you talk a lot about animal welfare. and we're talking about rotational grazing and that lifestyle. Can you explain that rotational grazing lifestyle being better for the animal, the land, but also our relationship with the animal, so the human animal
Well, one of
relationship?
the things that's good if you're doing rotational grazing, you're seeing your cattle all the time. Well, my former student, Lily Edwards Calloway, just did a big study on cattle handling, and they used the beef quality assurance cattle handling measurements. And some ranches are doing just a great job. And unfortunately, there were some ranches that were putting electric prods all over everything. But one of the things she found, this study is very interesting, is that people that just spend a lot of time around their cattle, like to check on them every day, out there amongst them, or check on them once a week, their cattle are a lot easier to handle when you put them through the chutes for vaccinating than cattle that you see people twice a year chasing them. And because there's been a lot of discussion in stockmanship about having animals run through the chutes to get them acclimated. Well, they weren't running them through the chutes. All they were doing is going out, checking on them. And if you're moving your cattle all the time and you're doing it right, they're going to get easier to handle.
So they see
You
you.
want to do when you switch pastures is you want to make sure you don't accidentally reward pushy behavior. If the cattle are pushing at a gate, wanting to switch pastures, you don't open the gate until they stand quietly. You want to reward polite behavior and then have them walk quietly past you.
That's probably good advice for any animal, I would imagine.
Well, that's right, because if you put the feed down when they're pushing and shoving, then you've rewarded pushing and shoving, and then you don't want big animals pushing and shoving. That's not
good.
nice.
It's good advice for child rearing as well. Okay, so I think this concludes the majority of our interview. I think one question I just want to ask in closing is, you've mentioned it several times, and I really want to drive the point home. If someone is looking to learn about what to grow, stock density, forageable cover crops, how to divide their pastures, you are saying look to someone local, find a local mentor.
You can go to your university extension service. You can go to local grazing workshops. I'd also recommend subscribing to the Stockman Grass Farmer. I'd recommend subscribing to that, because unfortunately, a lot of their good material is not readily available online. I can't even look any of it up and hit a paywall online. I'd recommend getting a subscription to that, and talking to lots of people, visiting places in your local area, because I want to make sure that when you start something new, that you have success with it.
It's good advice. Get some boots on the
Good
ground.
local advice, and maybe start off with just a few cattle. I'm not a big fan of just diving in the deep end of the pool when you're brand new at doing something.
It's all very, very good advice. We appreciate you so much. Is there anything else that you want to add that we
missed? You got to
missed?
make sure you have good animal welfare. If you're in arid country, you've got to watch the body condition on your animals and make sure that you maintain adequate body condition. Lameness, but one of the best ways to prevent lameness in beef cattle is breeding for good feet and legs. There's genetic issues with lameness. You want good leg conformation on your animals. That's really important.
It makes sense.
Before we part, I want to make sure we state the name of the paper we've been referencing tonight, in case we didn't mention it before. We are referring to Grazing Cattle, Sheep, and Goats are important parts of a sustainable agricultural future by Dr. Temple Grandin. You can find that online. Temple, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
It was great to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.